Hello, welcome to Apache TinkerPop's home here on Twitch. I'm Stephen Millette, and I'm here to introduce today's TinkerPop Wide stream, where we hear from folks using TinkerPop or graphs in the wider community to build libraries, tools, graphs, graph systems, or applications. For this session, we have Arthur from G.V, the Gremlin IDE, which is a powerful workbench for developing your graph queries, visually debugging Gremlin, doing graph analysis, and other neat things. He'll be talking about the product's roadmap and responding to questions. Please post your questions and comments in the events channel in Discord or in the chat on Twitch, and he'll try to get those answered for you. So without any further delay, I'll move out of the way and make room for Arthur.
Thanks, Stephen. Hey, everyone. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're just going to start the presentation here. So let me see. There we go. Okay, cool. We're on. So thanks, everyone, for joining. So today I'm just going to be spending a little bit of time talking about G.V, what's coming this year, and just a little bit more also about what's been happening over the last few months. So just before I start, really quickly, introductions and such. So my name's Arthur Bigeard. I'm essentially the lead developer of G.V. So G.V, if it's something you haven't used yet, is essentially a Gremlin IDE that you can install on your device, so Windows, Mac OS, Linux, etc., to write queries, connect to your Gremlin-powered databases, so Azure Cosmos DB, Neptune, etc. And essentially, it just provides an environment in which you can view your graph and play with it a lot more than, say, for instance, through the regular Gremlin console. So our goal is essentially to just offer both Gremlin experts and beginners a tool to get a better experience playing with graph databases that are Apache TinkerPop enabled. And G.V, I've probably said it 15 times already, but you pronounce it G.V. I know it causes a lot of confusion because of the syntax of it. So before I go on and start talking about roadmap, I thought it'd be good to just give a quick demo of the actual software if you haven't seen it, and just to kind of contextualize things. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop G.V on there. So the way G.V works is it just automatically detects your connection details and offers you a bunch of functionality around it based on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to real quick connect to a demo database. So this one here that I've got is actually running on ArcadeDB. And so you see, as I provide my details to connect to a database, it's just going to automatically prompt me for the next step. So for instance, on ArcadeDB, and that's something you'll probably see with Gremlin Server and a bunch of others, you may have to enter credentials. On Neptune, for instance, it could be identity and access management credentials. On Azure Cosmos DB, it could be an access key. The point is G.V should be smart enough to really know what to ask the user when they're trying to connect, and that's really meant to make it an overall easier experience to get onboarded. So in this case, all I need is to just enter my credentials. It's going to take a little second or two to get connected, check everything, and there we go, we're connected. So I'm just going to go ahead and create my connection. And now what's going to happen is G.V is connected to the database. It's just going to show me a little view of what's on it. So for instance, what you've got here is the Data Explorer view. It's actually just a view that's used to show your vertices and your edges in your database in a sort of destructured way. The idea is that you can sort of click on stuff and see how they connect to other elements. You can change the styling of the graph to see, exactly what's contained in your data. For instance, here, if I show the brewery name, you'll see that all my brewery edges will start showing their actual name. You can click on the elements to view the properties. You can edit them. You can modify them, etc., etc. So that's one of the things that G.V does, but then also it understands the data in your database. So for instance, if I look at the data model explorer for ArcadeDB, you'll see that it's built a little data model of the data that's contained. And so that just makes it a little bit more convenient, when you're trying to work with your data and perhaps you're trying to engineer a new data model to have this available. And the last thing is, with all this information that G.V builds about your database, it can then actually provide smart suggestions when you're writing your query. So for instance, this is a typical example of what G.V will do when you try and write a query. It will show you some documentation, because Gremlin could be a little bit difficult to learn sometimes, and just having this documentation handy as you're typing your query can be really helpful, but also it will provide you some smart suggestions. For instance, a really simple one here, but if I'm looking for breweries and I say I want to know what the outgoing relationships are, in this case, there's none actually. So we're just going to go in and you'll see, there we go. So we got Hasbury there, for instance, that's highlighted, which is one of the relationships that comes into the brewery. So this is essentially G.V. It really is meant to just make it a little bit easier to navigate your graph. There's a ton more feature, but I'm not going to show them all today. I'm just going to jump right back to the presentation, and we're going to just start talking a little bit more about the roadmap and what's happening. So let me just jump back on this. Okay, so in today's presentation, now we're beginning. I'm just going to start with a little recap of 2022, because it's been quite an important year for us. In fact, it's been pretty much the only year for us. Then I'll give an overview of the roadmap, both past and present. And once that's done, we'll just finish with questions and answers. So if you've got any questions, comments, just shoot them, and I should hopefully be able to respond to all of that. So just some little quick highlights, because I thought it was interesting before I was putting this presentation together. So G.V has been installed almost 2,000 times in 2022, which is great. It's getting a lot of traction. People are interested, they're using it. There's been a total of 18 updates throughout the year. We've supported 4 additional Apache TinkerPop enabled providers. So when G.V first started, it really just supported, I think, Gremlin, JanusGraph, and Amazon Neptune, and we've onboarded a lot more since. And during 2022, we've run an open beta phase, during which we gathered feedback, found bugs, did a bunch of fixes, and that's just gone really well. We've actually ended the open beta just a few weeks ago, and we've got now an official release with a lot of functionality that people can now use. Whereas obviously when it first started a year ago, we were kind of short on a few things. So this has all been really good to get a product that actually works for users. Now, in the 2022 roadmap, you might have seen there was a call last year where I discussed it. There's a lot of stuff. Not all of it made it. I just want to quickly go through what made it through this roadmap and what didn't. So for instance, we've improved the suggestion engine just to give better suggestions when you're typing your query. We've added this little data explorer view that you've just viewed earlier, in which you can just navigate your graph manually. We've seriously improved the connection onboarding user experience. So when you start entering your details for your database, G.V will now actually try and make an effort to give you good suggestions as to what you should enter next. We've got some improved error reporting during the typing of queries. We've allowed for queries to be saved and organized into folders. We've also added query debugging, which I'm not going to go through today because it's quite complex, but if you want, there's actually a video on our YouTube channel and on the main G.V website that actually shows a bit more about this. As I said, we've improved vendor support, put in a whole bunch of improvements, and we've moved to a WebGL-based graph visualization engine to allow for the rendering of really large graphs, which has been something that's been requested pretty early on in the development phase. There's a bunch of other stuff that partly made it. So for instance, query debugging, we've kind of got to the point of allowing for the simulation of traversals, which is really useful to be able to see how your query is actually behaving. And we've started improving the graph styling itself. Now, that's what made it, and there's a whole bunch that didn't make it. Now, the reason I'm talking about all this is because 2022 had a lot of stuff planned. It was very ambitious, and that means there's a few lessons we've learned about how to actually roadmap the product. And I'm presenting all this to say, hey, we've managed to get all this stuff last year, and all these other things that we haven't managed to do. And now we're going to try and produce a roadmap that is a little bit more realistic to the time we have and what we're actually trying to deliver. So you'll see, for instance, that one of the big features that didn't really make it is the ability to export, import G.V settings. I'll get back on that one later. The ability to create parameterized queries. So for instance, running a query that's saved on your software on G.V and providing a few parameters before running it. A bunch of other vendor-specific stuff, for instance, support for the JanusGraph data modeling API. the ability to import and export graphs that are remote. So typically, for instance, for Amazon Neptune or Azure Cosmos DB, code generation for connecting to the graph, migration to Monaco for query editor. Monaco is Visual Studio Code's own text editor. It's a really popular one. So, we thought at the time it would provide a more recognizable query editor experience than the one we have, but we haven't quite got around to putting that in place. So now that we've sort of covered what made it last year and what didn't, I can actually talk about some of the features that we're planning this year and that will make it. So the first one is actually a feature that we're planning to do next year, but that turned out a little bit more complex than we thought. And it's the ability to start working as a team on G.V. So right now, when you use G.V, you may have more than one person in your team that's actually using it. And it's very possible that you'll be working on queries or graph visualizations together. The problem is everything happens locally. And so one user will install G.V, write their queries, save them locally, and they'll be able to work with them. But then another user that might be using the same graph database will not have access to that. And that can be a bit limiting in the context of teamwork. So what we're trying to do with this feature is to aim user experience a bit more similar to, for instance, SQL Server, where you may have some shared stored procedures that can be managed and other stuff like this. So the idea is to try and create a simple and safe process to store this G.V related data between users. Now, one additional challenge rather with this particular functionality was, okay, where do we store the data? Because we don't really want to run in a situation where we're having to host potentially sensitive customer data. Say, for instance, if you write a query and it happened to contain something in it that we shouldn't really know. And so the idea is that all of this information will be stored directly on the database. There's two really big advantages to that. One is it's super easy for users to set up. If a user installs G.V, it connects to the same database as another user in your team, they'll both have access to the exact same stuff. So if the user has saved a query or a style sheet for a graph visualization, it will just be there and immediately available for users. And then the other thing is that it actually enables us, G.V, to not have to implement account management features, for instance, where people would suddenly have to authenticate to G.V so they can then access their data. So that's the first feature that we've got planned for this year, and it should hopefully be before the end of the second quarter. So think around the end of June. Now, the other one that we're thinking of having, and would like to have soon, in fact, is to have some more graph analytics functionality on G.V. So basically, there's a number of features in the Apache TinkerPop framework that allow to perform, relatively complex graph analytics options, and they're not always the easiest to harness. And so the goal with this feature is two things. One, to allow to perform simple graph analytics locally on the graph. So the idea is that you load data when you run a query on G.V, and it creates a graph. So you'll have a bunch of vertices and edges loaded, and we want to offer some common graph databases algorithm that you can just run right there and then with powerful visualization to explain the results. So a typical example, for instance, would be stuff like community detection, pathfinding, centrality, etc., but also to offer a user interface to create Gremlin queries that would perform those analytics functions on the relevant target TinkerPop providers, such as Gremlin, Janus Graph, or Neptune, to actually perform these analytics without writing the query. And again, to try and provide results that are a bit more meaningful and that can potentially be presented to other people. So again, this one should hopefully be around the end of quarter two. What might happen is it will be split in two. There will be a first half that will be graph analytics locally, and then the second half performing graph analytics using the actual TinkerPop framework. Now, the third one that I want to talk about today is to start working, or to start giving features on G.V to do data modeling. Now, there's quite a few different implementations of TinkerPop, and generally speaking, there are some that have the ability to enforce a data schema, similar, for instance, to I want to say SQL again, tables, etc., enforcing that the data that is being inserted on the database matches certain constraints. And there are others that do not have any kind of data schema. So we want to provide functionality that allows to manage those databases that have data schema constraints features more easily. Currently, you'll likely be constrained to use the native command line based or script based features available. So I'm thinking Janus Graph's data management API, schema management API, apologies, or DataStax Enterprise Graph's own data modeling API as well. Those require really just typing out your scripts, running them against a database, and making sure that they actually create the schema you expect. What we'd like to do on G.V is provide functionality that allows generating these scripts, first of all, more easily, but then also creating scripts that can update an existing data schema based on what's currently available. So it will be implemented in multiple steps. The first step, which will be kind of the easy one, is to just have a simple data schema script generation wizard on G.V that just generates a script to to actually enforce a data schema on Janus Graph or say DataStax Enterprise Graph, for instance. That will be step one. So based on the data available on your database, it will just generate the scripts, and that means you can just go off and run them without having to actually write them. And then the second step will be to actually have a proper data model drawing feature in which you would, rather than creating the data on a database and that's then driving what your data model is, to actually create the elements for your graph in the data model view, and that will then generate a data model script that you can go and run on your database. So you can then go and create data on it, because one of the problems with the step one approach is, if you want to use a constrained database but you haven't got the constraints in yet, then you won't be able to get your data in. So that's another big feature that we've got planned for this year. Now, there's other stuff that we want to do. There's not the only things that we're planning to do. One of the big focuses of late on G.V is on user experience improvement. So generally speaking, it means making G.V better in terms of performance, more pleasant to the eye, because admittedly, it did not start out the best looking piece of software, but also easier to use in general for first-time users or experienced Gremlin users. We're also planning to work a little bit on some Linux compatibility improvements. Earlier this year, we've done a little bit of work on macOS compatibility, and that's shown a huge improvement for users. So we'd like to do the same for Linux, which is also a perfectly valid user base. We want to do a migration to the Monaco text editor, which is the one that previously mentioned. Again, having Monaco in G.V will mean we have a more recognizable text editor, and it has a lot more functionality than the one we're currently using. We would like to have support for what's called Bezier curves. So Bezier curves are really just those edges that are round, not straight lines. The WebGL rendering engine that we use doesn't support them, so everything is straight lines at the moment, and that can mean for reading the graph sometimes, when there's a lot of elements, that's not always very convenient. So we'd like to have that in place, just for that little extra visibility, even with a large amount of elements. We'll have Janus Graph 1 support, so that's pretty much there. We're just waiting on an official release for it, and it should be good to go. We're going to optimize the data model loading process. So if you've used G.V before, you'll know that when you connect to a database, G.V will identify what's in your database. It will create this data model of what's in your database to provide better suggestions. So typically, for instance, that means loading the vertices. What are the vertices in your database? What are the edges in your database? What are the properties? Linking all that together. And so when you write a query, will then know which label to suggest, for instance. And that also powers a lot of functionality, for instance, around the styling of the graph. So no, if we don't know what the vertices in your graph are, we can't really provide styling options for each of the individual labels available in it. So we're going to try and make this whole process a little bit quicker. Right now, it is a little bit slow. It can take somewhere between 30 or 60 seconds to run for a given database, which means the first time you set up, it's going to be a little bit of wait, and then it gets refreshed a little bit too frequently. So that's another thing we're planning to have done this year. Now will most likely be in the coming month or two. And then on the non-technical side, because there's all these technical things like the actual software and making sure it works, making sure it has better functionality. We're also looking to try and just collaborate a little bit better with graph database providers, and that's going to come in a few ways. One is to try and put together a little bit more content in terms of blog posts and also hopefully videos to help people on board and start using Gremlin, but also just to kind of show, of course, the actual capabilities of G.V to a broader audience. So that will just be happening on and off throughout the year, and it will just be probably hosted that either directly on some partners, or we'll also have we have a YouTube channel with a few videos, and I think we'll look to put a bit more. So, for instance, a typical example would be a video to show how to stand up a Gremlin server with some basic configuration, how to modify these configurations, and then how to connect it with G.V. That could be a very simple example. So we'll try and put more of these together so that people that are not necessarily knowledgeable of graph databases and Apache TinkerPop in general can see some resources that will at least give them some extra information beyond, of course, what already exists and that works great, which is the official documentations for each of these providers and some books, and particularly Kelvin Lawrence's book. So yeah, that's essentially it for the roadmap. Now, one of the things that really helps us and that has shaped, I want to say that the software was people getting involved in a way and actually reaching out to us, telling us, okay, so this is good, but wouldn't it be nice if it could also do this? Maybe this could be done better. Maybe this could be done different. That doesn't work. Generally speaking, giving us feedback is extremely useful. You can contact us directly by email, support@gw.com. You'll typically get a response within a few hours, and there's no, there's no bad feedback. Feedback is always good. Us understanding what sort of issues you're encountering as you use the software or what you think could be done better means we can make it better for you. But you can actually also just find us on the Apache TinkerPop Discord itself. We're quite active, either because we're asking questions, because we're not sure how to do something in G.V, but also sometimes just to answer questions or just general chat. So if you have a question, if there's something you'd like to tell us, you can actually just message us directly there. And chances are this is basically me you're going to be talking to. But yeah. Another thing you could do, and that we're trying to put together at the moment, is if you have a testimonial, for instance, that you'd like to share. So say you've been using G.V in your company and you have maybe a team that you work with and it's been helping you develop software or put together some kind of process, or just generally speaking, being useful to the business. It would be great for us to actually hear about this because one, it's really nice to hear. We always love to hear people say G.V works for them. But two, that means, and obviously with your approval, we can let other people know this is the kind of stuff that you can achieve with G.V, and that helps get people to come in and say, okay, maybe I should try this out. You can follow us on Twitter. Twitter, we typically will post every week or so. Usually will be developer updates. So for instance, I'll be working on a new feature in G.V and I'll just say, hey, look, it looks presentable. It's not released yet. Here's a screenshot. Here's an animation showing how it works, what it does. And people can just see what it's about and know what's coming to the next update. We also post release updates. So for instance, when a new version of G.V will come out, typically will be announced through Twitter. And the announcement will really just contain the basics of, well, this is a new version number, and those are the highlights / all the features that are coming into it. So it's a good way to just find out immediately when there's an update available as well. And yeah, just as I said, tell us what you like or what you don't like, especially about G.V, and then we can make it better for everyone. So yeah, just before I finish, quick advertising time. So G.V is a product that you can actually buy, if you can believe it. You can download it for free with a 1-month trial. Now, there's 2 tiers of G.V. There's a free tier and there's a pro tier. Generally speaking, the way it works is if you're using an open source Apache TinkerPop database, you'll just get to use G.V for free pretty much permanently. There'll just be a couple of features that will be locked, but generally speaking, you'll have full access. And if you're using one of the commercial Apache TinkerPop databases, such as Neptune or Azure Cosmos DB, then you will need a pro license. So if you want to look into this a bit more, you can go to g.v.com/buy. Also, if you just want more time using it for free, if you have a free trial and it's expired and you need another month to try it out, it's fine. Send us an email, we'll extend your trial, we'll buy you that extra time so you can just continue playing with it and make sure that the solution is right for you. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for today. I guess we can probably just move on to questions if anyone's got any. But thanks a lot for listening and for attending. And yeah, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Arthur. There are a couple some questions we could throw out there. I guess one would be, would you say? I mean, there's a lot of like these kinds of not exactly these kinds of tools as G.V. I think G.V is like pretty unique in the sense of being having a debugging feature and having like these kinds of like pretty unique things built into it. But are there any solutions that you get some inspiration from when you're doing your designing of G.V?
Yeah. So I follow a lot of various graph technologies and accounts out there. And typically what that means, for instance, is sometimes I'll see, oh, hey, Neo4j has made a new release to their Bloom software, which is their sort of data explorer / IDE. And I'll see something in there that I like that G.V could really use, and that's really easy to implement. Just go and do it. So sometimes, the inspiration for G.V is just as plain as, hey, someone does it nicely. It would work great for Apache TinkerPop. Let's get it done. And other times it's just, I guess, for lack of a better way of being original ideas. And I guess query debugging is probably the best example of this, as it doesn't seem to be a functionality that you can really find anywhere else. So, some of the functionality you'll see in G.V will be ones that we, came up with more or less ourselves and that we hope you'll find useful. Others will be ones that you might see in other software out there that deals with graph databases. So you get a bit of tried and tested and test it for a bit,
Cool. What about this? How do you prioritize which features get developed first in G.V?
Yeah, that actually really varies. Generally speaking, the order of priority goes, if there's something that doesn't work right, that will be top priority. So usually if something looks a little bit iffy or someone reports a bug, that's the first thing that's going to get done with a plan to make a quick release. Notwithstanding issues, which don't happen that often, fortunately, then priorities are generally decided based on customer feedback quite a lot. And also just based on these little functionalities that we see from other providers. So the most important really is user feedback in here. This is the first thing that we look at. If someone tells us, hey, wouldn't it be nice if G.V had some team functionality, for instance, which is actually something that was recommended by a user, then this is something that we're going to evaluate a little bit, see if it's viable, see if it's useful, and then go, okay, cool. clearly this is going to be useful for people working teams. Let's make it happen. If a suggestion is for something that's not necessarily common, then that doesn't mean it gets rejected. It just means it's going to just go on the list. Every suggestion is recorded, it's tracked. That means I can just pick it up when I've got some free time and just get it done. Generally speaking, we'll focus on the ones that are asked by the users first.
Okay, cool. Looks like we have a question from Twitch. Where should users go for support with G.V?
Yeah, so for support with G.V, there's plenty of ways actually. We're pretty open channels, I want to say. So you can email us support@g.v.com. You can actually just message us directly on Twitter at g.v_ltd. You can message us directly on the Apache TinkerPop Discord as well. Essentially, any way you can get a hold of us, any one of these channels will respond and we'll give you help. There's also documentation available for G.V, so it's both in the software itself embedded, but there's also a website, docs.g.v.com that you can go to. But never hesitate to get directly in touch, and we'll be more than happy to help and make sure that you've got what you need to get through your use case.
Well, you've gotten a lot of. I mean, I'd say you've gotten a lot of done a lot of support.
Sorry, Steven, your audio is a little bit muted, by the way. It's kind of hard to hear you.
Sorry, let me turn up the. Is that better?
No better.
Okay. Yeah, is the you've gotten a lot of support done through by way of Discord, and that seems to be working really well. For you. That does seem like we get a lot of back and forth discussion there, in terms of like trying to help you understand like what the what is kind of like a priority for G.V. I feel like a lot of things that have come through there have like definitely landed in the product. So I think as far as like places to go for support, that's like one of the key areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's another: will there be any other products developed aside from G.V coming from G.V?
Yeah, good question. So at the moment, there's no immediate plans to make any other product. There's something about G.V that's perhaps a little bit different, which is it's developed as a software executable. It's something you have to install on your machine. It's not a website, for instance. And I know there's like a large appeal to having a website version of G.V because you just go on it, you can use it, etc. But it's something that we're not really looking at currently, just because there's a few other constraints around it. So our focus is just going to be on the G.V software itself at the moment. But the good news is the way it's being developed, because of the framework it uses, it's pretty much developed like a website. It's just deployed as a software executable. So in the future, if there are plans to provide some form of, say, for instance, website G.V Lite, or something that you could just go online and try out, and that would definitely be possible. That wouldn't happen this year. I suspect we would need to have something a little bit more mature before we can get to that. But those are possibilities that we're not excluding. And some other possibilities could just be tooling, command line tooling to support, for instance, different formats of graph, conversions between different technologies, etc. We've got options like this as well. So whilst there's no plans to actively develop something else right now, like another software in G.V, there are ideas floating around, and we have architected the software in such a way that there's a lot of reusable components there. So even though we're not planning it, we've not burned those bridges, if that makes sense.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see, maybe one more. Will there ever be any other languages supported in G.V?
Yeah, so that's something I'm really interested in doing, and that's actually something that was sort of planned early on, but I had to put to the side for a bit. The reason I'm really interested in doing this is because if you look at, for instance, Amazon Neptune, it supports Gremlin, but actually supports other languages as well, OpenCipher and Sparkle. And so, my thinking is, okay, is there people out there? There surely are people out there that use Amazon Neptune, but that are not using Gremlin, and it would be a shame for them to be missing out on using GWV because we're not supporting the right query language. So I'm very, very interested in supporting these things. So as far as languages go, yeah, I think there will be support at some point for other languages. At the moment, it's not for the 2023 roadmap, but there's some wiggle room. As far as other graph database technologies goes, right now, there's no immediate plan to do that. I think it's something keep in the back of my mind because, hey, we've already got software that has all these visualization components and this logic embedded, etc. Wouldn't it be neat if it was adapted to other technologies out there? But what it essentially boils down to is let's make it as good as we can for Gremlin. Let's make it really, really work for users. Let's find a formula that means people come in, try it, see that it's useful, make use of it, and then we can start expanding that to other languages and then potentially to other technologies. But for the foreseeable, the focus will definitely be on at least Apache TinkerPop compatible providers with a sort of retainer on having OpenCipher/Sparkle supported at some point.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds ambitious too.
So 2022 lessons learned. I'm not committing to that for 2023 yet. But
Well,
yeah, definitely,
I wouldn't put
definitely
it
in my
past
mind.
you to be able to do it and pull off whatever. I mean, I think you've managed to do a lot of things in a pretty short period of time. Cool. We got another question landing in from Twitch. Let's pop that up. Got a technical one there. How scalable is the
Yeah,
visualization engine, and are there limitations when it comes to extremely large graphs? That's a great question.
yeah, that's really good. So right now, there's actually two visualization engines in G.V. If you've been around long enough, you'll have used the one that is powered by something called Cytoscape.js. It's a great visualization library. It's actually the one, interestingly, that the newly released AWS Graph Data Explorer uses. It's great for producing beautiful graph visuals. One of the problem I had with it was performance. Typically, when you start getting to around 5,000 vertices, it gets a little bit slower. And so what I decided around June last year was, okay, we need what I've referred to as a WebGL-based rendering engine. I keep throwing that word, but basically there's two types of rendering. There's Canvas, which is very easy to develop and very good looking. And then there's WebGL, which is super performant, horribly hard to develop for. What we're intending to do is to move towards WebGL. Currently, we're using an open source framework called Sigma.js, which I highly recommend. It's great. And it has good performance. You could probably render, say, somewhere upwards of 50,000 edges and 15, 20,000 vertices without there being too much of a slowdown. There might be a bit of an initial overhead actually rendering the graph, but you'll see that it will be able to display a lot. It's not the best that can be. There are solutions out there, specialized visualization solutions that will render tens and tens of thousands of vertices and edges. Currently, we're trying to improve the performance, but you can expect an order of magnitude of around 50,000 edges and 10,000, 15,000 vertices. In terms of scaling, that's about as far as it goes before performance degrades. The other thing to keep in mind with extremely large graph visualization is there's a point where it can be a bit difficult to extract the valuable information from it. And so whilst we want to be able to display as much as possible on the screen, we're also aware that there's a point where it might not be that useful. We're trying to find the right middle grounds. But there are solutions out there that are really catered towards this large type of display. but they're generally not. They're usually more like SDKs rather than actual software you can, or websites that you can go on and connect your database, etc. We're actually investigating the use of some of these commercial frameworks. One of the reasons, one of the good things, I guess, with people buying G.V licenses is it actually funds improvements of the sort. So we are looking into that, but there's no plans as of yet to onboard one of those. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit more context to where we are right now, what we're thinking about, and what you can sort of get away with. Putting aside the visualization, before I forget, there's visualization and there's loading of actual data. So you could run a query that will fetch lots and lots of records. We've done some performance improvements last year to try and allow the software to load a little bit more in. We're going to continue doing that. I think there's definite value in being able to work with loading large amounts of records. We've actually purchased a framework called Kendo UI to put a little data table in G.V that's a lot more performance than the one that used to be there, with a lot more functionality. So we're trying to make improvements when it comes to big data handling.
Cool. Have you looked into, just along those same lines, have you looked into like 3D graph visualization at all, and what the options are there?
Yeah, there's a point in time where I pretty much scoured the entire internet for every single open source available graph visualization framework, and there's a lot. Now, to my knowledge, there is one framework that is open source and that supports 3D visualization, of which I'm not going to remember the name right now. But it's a very interesting one because not only it supports rendering an actual 3D of your graph, and I mean 3D, right? Like you're playing, I don't know, Quake 3D or something, right? And it also supports virtual reality, which I thought was really interesting. So, imagine you're using G.V, you just pop on your VR headset and you can see your graph right in your face. It's a very interesting framework. I've been keeping an eye on it a little bit. I haven't found, for instance, commercial implementations of this type of functionality, so I'm not really sure, what's out there, and if there's really anyone like in the company, for instance, trying to implement like the 3D rendering graph engine. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. It's one of those things that's possibly just nice to have, because there's not really enough, I guess, scholarly writing on the benefits of a full 3D rendered graph, no less a virtual reality one. But there are some frameworks that do out there. I think if you just quickly Google 3D graph rendering JavaScript, you're probably going to land on the framework that I'm just thinking about there. So it exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think the I don't know, moving around a graph is kind of a lot like a game in some respects. So looking at where video games have gone and game engines have gone to do some of that type of visualization, might be a better road to take. If you're thinking about that kind of thing. But it's I saw a really neat one. I think I've shared it with you in the past. Sky Rails, I think it's called. It's like a really old video, like it's ancient, but it's one of the coolest graph visualization demos I've ever seen. I guess I'll call it a demo. I could never get it to run myself when I tried to run it, but it's yeah, it was really neat. And I mean, I think it kind of at least showcased what might be actually possible in that space.
Yeah, and then the other interesting part, I guess, is when it comes to graph visualization, I sort of touched on it with Colin Greer's question, is at what point your graph is just too big to visually derive information from. And I think this is where the graph analytics functionality that I'm looking to bring into G.V will hopefully help by allowing users to run some popular graph analytics algorithms to try and extract the valuable information from their graph without necessarily having to just go and look around left and right in every possible direction. So I think there's some component of
what sort of insights can you draw from the graph programmatically before you rely on you're just squinting at your graph and seeing what you can make from it. I'm seeing someone's commenting about the use of OpenGL for graph rendering. So I believe, and this is all, it's kind of a restriction of sorts with G.V because of the way it's built. It's built using a framework called Electron.js, which is basically what you use if you use Microsoft Teams or Visual Studio Code or the Discord application even, or Slack. The problem with that framework is it's basically just Chromium packaged into an executable in which you put your own code. And because it's Chromium, it will not support OpenGL. It will be restricted to WebGL. I guess the best hope G.V has for this is if Chromium were to create better support for graphics library, ones that might allow them to be better in terms of performance, possibly better in terms of development experience as well. That could help bring some progress to the software as a whole. But as of right now, I'm not fully aware of any developments on that side, but definitely something to keep an eye on. So yeah.
Okay, good discussion. I think that's all of our questions. I don't know if anyone has anything else. If not, then I think we'll kind of end for the day. Let's see here. So, 1 second. Try and get back to. So yeah, I think that's all the questions. Thank you, Arthur, for delivering this presentation here today. Thank you all for watching this TinkerPop Wide event today. And we'll see you all around for the next one. Take care.
Thanks, Ewan. Thanks, everyone. See you.